Hey everybody, I'm Pastor Joshua Sullivan at Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Kerrville, Texas. Welcome back to another episode of ATP, Ask the Pastor. If you have something you'd like to ask the pastor, email me at atpholycross@gmail.com. We'll put your question in the queue and we'll get to you as soon as possible. Also check out ATP books and other goodies that we have down in the video description below, including a searchable database of all the videos. All right, today's question. Dear Pastor, I wanted to ask your opinion on the reservation of the sacrament and the use of things like tabernacles for this purpose. I've seen it primarily in Roman churches and in Anglo-Catholic congregations, but recently I've seen it in some Lutheran churches. If it's not done for the worship and adoration of the elements, is it a legitimate practice, or do you have another opinion on this? Yeah, so I'm aware of Lutheran pastors reserving the consecrated elements in tabernacles. And it's my understanding that the reserved elements then are taken later in the week to the sick and the shut-in, or used during the next celebration of the Lord's Supper. The rationale for reserving the host, the consecrated bread in a tabernacle, is the belief that Christ's sacramental presence endures indefinitely in the consecrated elements, until those consecrated elements are consumed. Since the word of the Lord endures forever, any interval of time between consecration and then distribution and reception of the individual then is irrelevant. However, rather than debating the duration of Christ's sacramental presence, I think a better way to go about this topic is about the practice of reservation is to compare it with Christ's institution of the Lord's Supper and see whether or not that practice agrees with Christ's institution. So when Christ instituted the sacrament, it was an action that consisted of three parts. St. Matthew writes, Jesus took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. For this is the blood of the New Testament, which is shed for you for the remission of sins." So in the institution, we see three actions, so to speak. The first is consecration. Jesus takes bread and wine and gives thanks. The second action is distribution. He gives the consecrated bread and wine to the disciples to eat and drink. And the third action then is reception, that the disciples actually receive it and eat and drink it. Now, that eating and drinking is assumed in Matthew's gospel, but Mark explicitly says in Mark 14:23, and they all drank from it. So the sacrament is an action consisting of consecration, distribution, and reception, otherwise known as eating and drinking. Lutherans confess this in the Formula of Concord. We say, but this blessing alone, or the recitation of the words of institution of Christ, constitute no sacrament if the whole action of this supper, as it was ordered by Christ, be not observed. If, for instance, the consecrated bread be not administered, received, and enjoyed, but be locked up, sacrificed, or borne about. But the command of Christ, this do, must be observed entire and inviolate, which comprises the whole action or administration of the sacrament, namely, in a Christian assembly to take bread and wine, to bless, to administer, and to receive them, that is, to eat and drink, and at the same time to show the death of the Lord, as also St. Paul presents before our eyes the whole action of breaking bread or of distributing it and receiving it. 1 Corinthians 10, 16, and 17. What we're confessing here is that all three actions must be done in order to celebrate the sacrament the way that Christ instituted it. If all three actions aren't observed, there's no sacrament. So when the Roman Church consecrates bread, encloses it in a monstrance, and then parades it about at a Corpus Christi parade, or lets people adore it during Eucharistic adoration in the tabernacle, Rome is replacing the action of distribution and reception with different actions. Therefore, what's being adored at Eucharistic adoration is not the body of Christ. What's being reverenced at Corpus Christi processions isn't the body of Christ, because those actions are outside of the sacramental actions that Christ instituted. Now, When a Lutheran pastor reserves the sacrament in a tabernacle, it's not for the purpose of adoration or to parade it about. It's usually, like I said at the beginning, simply for the purpose of taking communion to the sick, to the shut-in, to the hospitalized later on throughout the week. However, Martin Chemnitz, one of the authors of the Formula of Concord, he argued that the sacrament shouldn't be reserved under any circumstances. And his reason was very simple. The reservation separates sacramental action. He didn't approve of consecration that wasn't followed immediately by distribution and reception. Chemnitz writes in his examination on the Council of Trent, he says this, "The matter is not obscure if we set before ourselves as norm and rule the description of the institution. For Christ first of all used his words, which he wanted to have come to the element in order that it might become a sacrament. He used them in the place and at the time where and when he was about to distribute communion, and in the presence of those whom he wanted to communicate his body and blood. Therefore it agrees better with the description of the institution and example of Christ to recite the words of institution and by means of them to bless the Eucharist at the place and time of communion, in the presence of those who are to be communed, rather than at another place and time in the absence of those to whom it was to be offered." So Christ instituted the sacrament at the time when and at the place where he was going to distribute it, and the disciples were going to eat and drink it. They were going to receive it. Chemnitz also states that the words take, eat, and do this aren't directed at the elements alone, but to those who are about to commune. Therefore, he writes, it is not in accord with the institution to direct these words only to the bread and wine, and that in the absence of those who are to be communed. Elsewhere, he writes that it's the papists who constructed the idea that by virtue of the words of institution, Christ is compelled to remain in the bread and wine with his body and blood in this enduring union for days, months, or even years. For Chemnitz, reservation is unacceptable because because it separates the sacramental action. Now, following this, Johann Gerhard in the next generation, he notes that Jesus didn't delay for a lengthy period of time before distributing it to the disciples. He writes, "Accordingly, if it is to be called the Lord's Supper, the distribution is to take place shortly after the blessing or consecration, and the distribution is to be shortly followed by the communicants, eating of the consecrated and distributed bread." Since separating the sacramental action by reservation, it can introduce doubt, it does introduce speculations into the Lord's Supper, it's something that is best avoided. The best practice is for the minister to consume the reliqua, that is, any remaining consecrated elements after everyone else has communed. This way the sacramental action of consecration, distribution, and reception is observed as Christ commanded. This was Luther's private practice, or rather public practice, I guess we should say. It was also his counsel to a man named Simon Wulfernus in 1543. He wrote to Wulfernus, "For you can do what we have done here in Wittenberg, namely, to eat and drink the remains of the sacrament with the communicants, so that it is not necessary to raise these scandalous and dangerous questions about when the action of the sacrament ends, questions on which you will choke unless you come to your senses." So the celebrant, the pastor who celebrates the Lord's Supper, then any other pastors that are with him then should reverently consume the reliqua, any leftover consecrated bread and wine, since Christ says, take, eat, and take, drink. That practice there cuts off all speculations simply by doing what Christ has commanded to be done in the institution. Then, when the pastor takes communion to the sick, he then consecrates bread and wine in the person's home, at the hospital, at the care facility, wherever they may be, in the hearing of the person that is to be communed. All of this agrees much better with Christ's institution than reserving the sacrament, which, honestly, only introduces more questions than it answers. That's my take. We'll see you next time for another episode of ATP Ask the Pastor.